Hello, everyone. My name is Nate Walden. I'm an innovative learning specialist with 5-Star Technology Solutions, and we are going to talk about authentic assessment. So in this short video tutorial, we will be talking about authentic assessment. We're going to start by defining what we mean by authentic assessment. We'll then spend some time comparing authentic assessment to more traditional types of assessment in your classroom. And then we'll end by talking about how you can go about planning and developing authentic assessments to use in your classroom. So let's go ahead and start by defining what we mean by authentic assessment. And this is kind of my favorite definition from John Mueller. And he calls authentic assessment a form of assessment in which students are asked to perform real-world tasks that demonstrate meaningful application of essential knowledge and skills. So to sort of break that definition down, the sort of 3 key points that I want you to be thinking about as we go through this little workshop is first, we're asking students to perform. So the students are doing something. There's an action that the students are participating in. What they're performing is a real world task. So this is not just something that is only applicable to the 4 walls of our classroom. We're looking at an activity that has real world implications, something that they may encounter in their careers or in their lives outside of a classroom setting. And then the final part of this definition that I want to point out is the word application. So the big difference, as we're going to see, between authentic assessment and maybe more traditional types of assessments are that we are not simply asking students to be able to recall facts that we've taught them. We want them to apply, that we want them to actually be using the knowledge and skills that we've taught them. So it's not about recalling facts, it's about applying those facts that we've learned in the classroom. So let's take a few minutes to compare traditional assessments with authentic assessments. And let's first look at sort of why there's assessment at all. Why are we assessing in our classrooms? And we'll start with sort of the traditional approach to assessment. And by traditional, I mean, your end of chapter tests that you give. Generally, they're, probably multiple choice or short answer matching, true, false, maybe a short essay question, but those traditional types of tests and quizzes that you're used to seeing in a classroom setting. So why do we give those assessments? Well, it starts with the kind of thesis that the students need to be productive citizens. That's sort of the whole point of school. That's the argument we're making. The whole reason we send kids to school is that they need to be productive citizens in our society. So since we've decided they need to be productive citizens, and that's why they're going to school, we believe in the traditional assessment model that students, in order to do that, in order to be productive citizens, there's a set of knowledge and skills that they need in order to be productive. And because we believe there's a set of knowledge and skills, it's then incumbent upon the school to teach that. And if we're going to teach it, we need to make sure that the students have mastered it. And in order to make sure the students have mastered those knowledge and skills, we need to test them on it. And then that's where our traditional tests come from. Authentic assessment is similar, but you're going to notice some slight changes here. With authentic assessment, we start with the same thesis. We start with the same idea that students need to be productive citizens in our society. So that hasn't changed. What changes is, on the authentic assessment side, we believe that in order to be productive citizens, there's a need for students to be able to perform meaningful tasks. So it's not just about having this set of knowledge, owning this knowledge, but it's about being able to perform tasks in your society. So if students need to be able to perform those tasks, then it's incumbent upon the schools to develop those skills. We should be developing in our students the skills that they're going to need to perform these real world tasks. And if we need to develop those skills, then we need to be asking our students to practice those skills through our classroom content. So that's sort of the difference between where the traditional assessment comes in and where authentic assessment comes in. So let's kind of break down in some categories here the difference between the two. So as I kind of mentioned or hinted at before, traditional assessment generally asks students to recall the content we taught them. So here's a question, multiple choice, recall the answer. I taught you this in class. Whereas authentic assessment wants our students to apply that content, use it in some way. Generally speaking, traditional assessments are asking students to select a correct response. So again, more often than not, that's in a multiple choice fashion. But again, it can be true, false, or matching, or even a short answer kind of question is still selecting a response that you are expecting them to give. Whereas authentic assessments is asking your students to perform a task. Here's a task that I want you to do. Use our content that I've taught you to perform this task. Traditional assessment, generally speaking, is kind of only exists in the contrived, what I call game of school. So if you think back in your sort of real lives, when was the last time you were actually asked to take a traditional test in your life? Not in school, not when you're working on your degree or in college or whatever, but in life, when was the last time you were actually asked to take a test? It doesn't happen very often, if it happens at all, in the real world. So it's only exists in this contrived school setting that we've created. Whereas authentic assessment, if it's done well, should be mirroring or modeling an actual real world scenario that your students might encounter outside of school. Traditional assessments generally is very teacher-centered, and in a couple of ways. Teacher-centered in that the teacher is selecting the question and the teacher has a specific answer they're looking for the student to give. Whereas authentic assessment is generally a little more open, where the student has the ability to make a couple of choices about how they are going to perform that task. The teacher is sort of providing the scenario, and then it becomes incumbent on the student to perform in the way of their choosing. Traditional assessment is also pretty teacher-centered, if we're being honest with ourselves, because quite frankly, the reason that most of us choose to give multiple choice tests is because they're very easy to grade. And while that's beneficial and sometimes necessary, it's focused on the teacher, not the student. And then finally, traditional assessments give us indirect evidence of mastery. Again, the whole reason we're assessing is because we're trying to see if our students have achieved a proficiency level or a mastery level of the content. And traditional, multiple choice style tests can give us some evidence, but it's sort of indirect evidence, meaning we know if they got the question right or wrong, but that's all we know. We don't know if they guessed randomly on that multiple choice question and happened to get it right, or even worse, true, false, when it's just sort of a 50-50 toss-up. We don't know if, they knew the answer, but do they understand the answer? Maybe, on your math test, they were able to tell you that the Pythagorean theorem was a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Sure, points, you got it right. But do they know what that means? Do they know how to use that when they use that? You don't get a lot of evidence from traditional assessments that you can be very direct about, as opposed to authentic assessments, when you just say, hey, here's a scenario, here's a problem, now create something, perform a task, and based on your performance, I know what you understand and what you do and don't know. And the evidence you're collecting in those assessments is, again, much more direct than you get from a traditional assessment. So I want to take a moment to explain that we're not trying to vilify traditional assessment. I'm not saying it's horrible, you shouldn't be doing it, and if you're doing it, you're a bad teacher. There may still be room for traditional assessments in your class partnered with authentic assessment. It's not necessarily one or the other. But my point with this little session is to kind of get you to understand that these two don't necessarily carry the same weight. And a great analogy for this, again, that John Mueller presented that I really, really like and really kind of drove this point home for me, was ask yourself, if you were trying to hire someone to chauffeur you around. You were hiring a driver for yourself, and you had two candidates. Which candidate would you prefer? Would you prefer the candidate that failed their written portion of the driving test or the road portion of the driver's test? Would you rather have somebody that knew all the answers to the written test or was able to actually drive the car? Obviously, in a perfect world, ideally, we would want both. But if you're presented with those two options, I think we're all going to choose the person that was able to actually drive the car. So that's the authentic assessment. Can you use the knowledge? Can you use what I've taught you to perform a task? That's the driving test. That's the actual road portion of getting your driver's license. Now, you should be able to pass the written test, the traditional test that basically asks you to regurgitate all the rules of the road. But if you can't pass the driving, the actual road test, then you don't even know why. Yeah, sure, you passed the written test, but you don't know how to do any of that. You were able to regurgitate the answers I taught you, but you can't use it. That's the difference between traditional and authentic assessment. Again, you can use both, but authentic assessment is really the goal. It doesn't do us any good for our students to be able to recall facts if they cannot actually use them. Okay, so now let's talk about how you go about planning your authentic assessment. And to do that, we're going to compare it to traditional assessment. So let's start with traditional assessment. Generally speaking, if you're planning a unit that's going to end in a traditional, end of chapter or end of unit multiple choice test, you start with, what body of knowledge do I need my students to know? And yes, we all have our standards, but I think the trap that many of us fall into, especially younger, newer teachers, they allow their textbooks to dictate that body of knowledge way too much. We let our textbooks dictate what we're teaching, the pace at which we're teaching, the order at which we're teaching, without much thought. So yes, textbooks are a helpful resource, but don't hand over your entire course to your textbook. That's just my little PSA on textbooks. But in a traditional assessment unit, you start with, what content do I want my students to know? And then you move into planning your daily learning activities that are going to teach that set of content, that knowledge that you want them to know. And then when all's said and done, once you've taught them all that, you write a test, you develop your assessment, and the students take that assessment. That's generally the flow of how a traditional assessment unit would work. Authentic assessment sort of flips that and goes in the other direction, or what Understanding by Design calls backward design. In authentic assessment, you don't necessarily start with, what content do I want my students to know? You start with, what is my performance outcome? At the end of this unit, what do I want my students to be able to know and to understand? And once I've identified that, then I develop my assessment. Once I know what do I want my students to understand and know at the end and be able to do at the end of this unit, then I develop my assessment. What performance task can I create that is going to show me whether or not my students understand and can do what I said I wanted them to? And after you've developed that task, that performance task, that authentic assessment, only then do you start focusing on what is your daily learning activities going to be, because each learning activity should be directly related to the performance task you're going to ask them to do at the end of the unit. In fact, I would tell them what that performance task is at the beginning of the unit. That way, every lesson that you're teaching leading up to it, your students know why you're teaching that lesson, because you're able to directly point back to the performance task they're going to be asked to do at the end of the unit. This is why we're doing this today, because it's part of this task. And again, the assessment you're developing in traditional assessments is just asking your students to recall some facts. In authentic assessments, you're developing an assessment that asks them to apply what they have learned. Okay, so how do we go about developing authentic assessment? I basically have this broken down into 4 parts. You start by, as I mentioned, identify your outcomes. Start with what you want them to be able to do by the end. Then you develop your performance task. What real world scenario am I creating and asking them to do that's going to prove mastery or proficiency in the outcomes that I've identified? From there, you create a rubric. And I'll just mention right now that if there's no rubric for your assessment, it's probably not an authentic assessment. If there's no rubric, that means there's an answer key. And if there's an answer key, that means there's a specific correct answer you're looking for, and that's a traditional assessment. And then once you've created your rubric, that's when you begin developing your learning activities that are going to help your students achieve proficiency in your performance task. Okay, so let's take those 4 steps and break them down. We start by identifying our outcomes. And again, I'm going to do a kind of compare and contrast between traditional and authentic assessment here. And I'm going to use a U.S. history example because that's what I taught before I left the classroom. So we're going to go with the first unit I used to teach my students in 8th grade U.S. history. And that was the European colonization of North America. And in that unit, I basically covered these 4 standards that I've listed here. I'm not going to read them for you, but it's basically about Europeans colonizing North America and the interactions they had with native tribes who were already living there. And I would teach that unit, cover those 4 standards, and then usually give a mostly multiple choice assessment at the end of the unit. Maybe there was a short essay question at the end, but it was a very traditional assessment. If I wanted to take a more authentic approach to assessment, yes, I still have to cover my 4 standards here, but I need to ask myself, why are those standards important? Or what understanding by design, they would ask, what do I want my students to understand about these standards? Why are they important? Why do they need to know this? And if you can't answer that question, if you can't answer, there's a standard that you're supposed to teach, and you cannot answer why your students would ever need to know this, then I guess sure, cover it. It's a standard. Maybe don't spend more than a day on it if you can't come up with a real reason to know it, but you definitely don't need to be developing an assessment about it. You're allowed to rank your standards in order of importance, and those standards that you don't feel are very important, don't waste your time on them, and definitely do not come up with an assessment over them. So you should be able to identify why these standards are important, why your students need to understand it. And so for this example, I've taken these 4 standards and I've come up with sort of 4 understandings that I want my students to know. I want them to understand that immigration and cultural diversity can have positive and negative effects depending on motivation. I want them to understand that people immigrate for a variety of reasons, that immigration is difficult, and that empathy is important. So instead of going into this unit focused on the very specific 4 standards here, I'm going into this unit with my focus on these are the outcomes that I want my students to have by the end of this. And that's going to change the way I approach teaching those units. And in addition to those sort of content standard goals, maybe I also want to add a couple of skills. So first, I want to draw a direct correlation between what I've said my outcomes are to what standards they apply, just so you can see that I'm not teaching my standards. I'm teaching them with outcomes in mind. So this first outcome meets the first and third standard that I've identified. The second one is the second and fourth. The third one is the first and the third. And the fourth one is the first and the third as well. Okay, so I am still teaching my standards just with these outcomes in mind. Now back to the skills that I was referring to. In addition to these standards, maybe in this unit, I also want to focus on getting my students to collaborate effectively and communicate effectively. So that's also going to play a role in how I assess my students. Okay, so from there, we have our goals in mind. So now I have to develop performance tasks. What real world based scenario can I develop that will mirror a task that a student might be asked to do in their real lives or in their careers that will hit on these goals? So one example of that I sort of developed would be in a collaborative group, using the knowledge of your community and the history of immigration in America, develop and present an action plan to assist newly immigrated individuals transitioning into our community. Okay, that hits on all of my goals. They're going to be working in collaborative groups together. They're going to be developing an action plan that they have to communicate to hopefully an authentic audience. If you can get someone that actually works with immigrated individuals for this unit, great, but let's not get into the weeds on that. And in order to do all that, they're going to have to understand that there are positive and negative effects to immigration and that people immigrate for a variety of reasons, and it's not an easy process to do. And it's going to ask them to be empathetic with people who are immigrating. And they're going to do all of this understanding the historical context of reasons why different groups have immigrated throughout American history. So that's not a multiple choice test that they're going to regurgitate answers to. They're developing their own action plan, which is something they may be asked to do in their careers or in their personal lives. It's a much more authentic way of assessing whether your students understand what you just taught them. Now, that is a huge end of unit task. That's very project-based learning type of task. You don't have to have an end of unit big task like that necessarily. You could have smaller authentic assessments throughout your unit. And one example of that might be, I could ask my students to pretend they are the leader of a North American tribe, and they need to analyze all the different European countries that are colonizing North America and decide which one they see as the biggest threat. Which one are they worried about the most and why? And they're going to write a speech. Maybe you ask them to actually deliver their speeches. Now, that doesn't hit necessarily on every single one of my goals, but it hit on 4 of them. And maybe I come up with another performance task that's going to get the 2 that this particular task didn't get to. So those are sort of examples on how maybe you could develop a performance task based on the outcomes that you have identified. Okay, so now let's move on to creating a rubric. Again, if there isn't a rubric, it's not an authentic assessment, because rubrics basically outline the expectations for what the students are going to do. But beyond that, the students have the freedom of choice to develop or perform that task in their own way. It's not an answer key. It's a rubric, and that's what makes it more authentic than traditional. I would suggest that once you've developed your rubric, you supply it to your students. You let the students see the rubric that they are going to be graded with as early as possible. I would say do it at the beginning of the unit. Again, I've already suggested that you let them know what their performance task is going to be at the beginning of the unit. I would give them the rubric at the same time. That way, every day as you're teaching, they are fully aware why you're teaching that particular lesson. And it sort of eliminates the why do I need to know this question. Now, I used to dread making rubrics. I always thought I was really bad at them. I could never come up with the wording for what goes in which category to award what point. What does a proficient level of this category look like as opposed to the next level down? And then I was sitting in some kind of professional development session, and somebody said something that was just so eye-opening for me. And then I kind of felt stupid for never thinking of this myself. But when you're developing a rubric, just start with the content standard. Look at how the standard is worded. And however the standard is worded, that's your proficiency or your mastery level. So for example, with this standard, it's asking them to compare and contrast reasons for colonizing the New World. Use those exact verbs that they use. They're using them for a reason. So if that's the expectation, that students can compare and contrast the reasons for different European countries colonizing the New World, then that's what goes in your proficiency box. If a student can do that, that's what the standard was asking them to do. That's proficient or mastery, whichever word you use for you've achieved the goal I want you to achieve. And then from there, you can start looking at, all right, if I wanted them to be able to compare and contrast this thing, what's one step down from that? Well, maybe they weren't able to compare and contrast the differences, but they could at least identify the reasons. They just weren't able to make a comparison between them. That would be the next step down. The next step down from that would be to really struggle to even identify multiple reasons for colonization. And then what's the one step up? Well, not only are you able to compare and contrast, but you also demonstrated that you understand what the implications of that were, what the differences, what the impacts of the different reasons were. Okay. And that just understanding that you start with the actual standard as proficiency or mastery, it made building rubrics so much easier for me once I kind of grasped that. Maybe I'm the only person that didn't get that, but if you didn't get that, there's my gift to you. It makes building rubrics a lot easier. That's how you kind of build your content standards in your rubric. But then also remember, I said I also wanted to test on some skills. I was going to test on collaboration and communication. And testing on skills, creating a rubric for that can be a little more difficult. The New Tech Network has created rubrics for all the sort of 21st century skills. You know, they have a collaboration rubric, they have a communication rubric, they have, I believe, a critical thinking rubric, and they have rubrics based on levels. So they've got like a high school version of the rubric, a middle school rubric, and so on. So I would really check that out. Now, those rubrics are are long. Like the collaboration rubric might have like 8 different criteria on it. I would not suggest you select all 8 of those. Pick 1 or 2 from the collaboration rubric that you want to see your students proficient in, and include those in your rubric with your other standards. So that's my recommendation on creating a rubric. And then finally, only then do you start actually developing the learning activities that you're going to do in your classroom. And as I mentioned, each learning activity should point directly towards one line, or hopefully multiple lines, but at the very least 1 line on that rubric that's going to help them reach proficiency in that particular category. And these learning activities are your students' opportunity to practice whatever task you're asking them to perform in the performance task. If in the performance task, you're asking students to compare and contrast something, the first time they do that better not be in the performance task. You should be practicing comparing and contrasting as you're working your way towards that performance task in your learning activities. All right, so to sort of summarize, you begin with thinking to yourself, what real-world scenario can I create in my classroom where my students would actually need the information, the content, and skills that I'm teaching? Why is this important? Once you've identified that, ask yourself, how can I mirror that situation, that real-world situation or scenario in my classroom? What task could I ask them to do in my classroom that would mirror this real-world application? And then ask yourself, what is student proficiency or mastery look like on that task? If a student is able to master this scenario, what does that look like? And build your rubric from there. And that's how you create authentic assessments in your classroom. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you found it helpful. Here are some resources if you want to think some more about authentic assessment. Again, I mentioned John Mueller multiple times, so all you have to do is Google his authentic assessment toolbox, and it's a great website. Understanding by Design, again, the sort of backwards design approach to getting your students to be able to apply what you taught them by Wiggins and McTighe is amazing. New Tech Network is where I found the rubrics for the 21st century skills. Thanks again.